Hi everyone, my name is Anthony and I am actually on the iOS team at Wayfair. You might be wondering, why would I care about Kotlin? Well, actually, it's probably even easier to convince someone that knows Swift how to start writing Kotlin because the languages are really similar compared to like Java to Kotlin. So what I wanted to do was kind of investigate whether or not we could use what is currently there for Kotlin Native to figure out if we could share code between our Android and iOS projects. So what is Kotlin Native? Right now it's just a technology for compiling Kotlin into native libraries that run without any VM. It fully supports interoperability with native code. And one of the big things is that there's platform libraries that have been converted by the JetBrains team, which allow us to kind of use those in Kotlin Native. So for us, that means that some of the iOS standard frameworks are already there that we can utilize in Kotlin, and that will come in handy going through all this. So one of the big reasons that why I wanted to investigate this was actually when Kotlin Native version 0.5 came out. The thing with this version was that we finally had the ability to do reverse interop with Objective-C in Swift, or from Objective-C in Swift. So what that meant was you could call Kotlin code in your Swift code. And to do that, we actually needed support for compiling a framework. So what we do right now is you can actually write your Kotlin code, and that will compile into a specific iOS framework. And then from there, you can just import it and call it as if it was any regular Swift framework or Objective-C framework. And that was super helpful because before that, all you could do was write a whole project in Kotlin and use the platform-specific libraries. But that was really kind of janky because you were trying to call like table views and all of these iOS-specific things in Kotlin, and it made more code versus like saving on code. So having libraries is allowing us to kind of write what we want to write in Kotlin and then call specifically into that when we need it on the iOS side. So the goal of our project, or the project I investigated, was we want to configure a Kotlin framework and get it set up in Xcode. And then from there, we were going to use what we use on the Wayfair iOS team, which is Viper, which is our framework for writing our code on iOS. And we want to get as much of that into Kotlin code. Anything that wasn't needing anything specific from the iOS framework, so basically all of our business logic into Kotlin. And then we wanted to make a request and parse data in Kotlin Native, and then finally return the model of data back into our view model, which would then be set up in Swift in our view controller or activity or whatever you would call it on the Android side. So the goal was to get this to present at the end, which is just requesting from Wayfair a list of products. These are just a bunch of different sofa names and having them print out as labels on an app. So we kind of went through a variation of Viper code in the last talk, but in Swift, what we're doing is we're starting with our router, which is where we're setting up all of our Viper code. And that's the main area where we're pushing a new screen onto our app. And that needs specific iOS frameworks to allow us to do that. So that is in the iOS specific side. But then everything else moves into pure Swift code, which is just the repository where we make requests to our server, the interactor, which is grabbing those data models and passing them along to our presenter. The presenter is creating a data model for our view controller, which is where we actually present our screen. So only the view controller and the router we can't really mess with. We need to keep that in iOS or in Swift. And then everything else we can kind of move up into Kotlin code. So that's what I tried to do here, and here are some of the Kotlin files that we had. So question, the first thing we need to do is figure out how do we go about making requests in Kotlin Native. And at the time, the only two ways I knew of doing this was through the examples that were given on JetBrains' website, or on their GitHub. And one of the ways was libcurl, which is a native kind of library for making web requests. And it's not the most concise thing. It's kind of like based off of C, so it's going to look really kind of difficult to use and set up. So I actually went the other route, which is using one of our platform libraries that JetBrains converted for us and allowing us to use all of the iOS code, but writing it in Kotlin. So just to give you a quick background of what that looks like in Swift, we're pretty much making a URL request, which so what we have to do here is set up a URL session, and then we create a data task, and all that's doing is making an asynchronous request given a URL, and the response is a closure that gives us data back, and from there we can parse JSON or do whatever we want with it. And even this is a lot of code for iOS developers. A lot of times they end up using a framework instead to do this in like one call. So what does this look like in Kotlin? Well, it looks like a lot more. And the reason for this is actually, if I go back to this slide, here you might see we're using the default configuration for URL session. And when I tried doing that in Kotlin, it actually crashed when it was trying to run the project. And the reason for this, I found out from someone at JetBrains, is actually that there's special properties or special cases around using Kotlin Native and passing objects through different threads that you have to be careful of, especially with like iOS or Kotlin and Swift. So what they recommended was that I implement my own Delegate protocol to use for that NS URL session. And this is kind of what it looks like. Essentially what it's doing is allowing it to be more thread safe for requesting this data. But it ends up working, and the completion handler receives data, and we're able to then move on to parsing JSON. So now this is also another problem that we had to deal with, and that's hopefully actually in the future is going to be mitigated by the version 0.6 that just came out, which allows you to have interop between collections on the iOS and Android, or iOS and Kotlin. So instead of having to do all of these weird conversions where I set up extension functions on the bottom there, you should be able to pass like an NS dictionary into just something on the Kotlin side and be able to handle that one-to-one instead of doing these kind of weird conversions. And this is actually based off of code that was in one of the example projects that they had, or JetBrains had on their GitHub. So it does work. We're able to take that JSON data, create it into a JSON object, and then kind of walk through that and create our browse product model. And this just contains a product name, a manufacturer name, the list price, and a SKU number. And here's where Kotlin really starts to show, which is how we write the rest of our Kotlin code. At this point in the interactor, we're just making this request, and we're getting the closure back, and in there we can just do our parsing of JSON, and from there we'll get our entity back, which is basically our data model, because all we have is this browse product array. But from there we're passing it into our presenter that we have at the top here, and our presenter for this case is just passing data along to our view controller. And on the bottom here you can see we have our data classes for setting up view models and some interfaces that surprisingly actually work in Swift. So you can write an interface in Kotlin and then have that extend off of some sort of Swift class. So that was pretty interesting to do. But yeah, so the rest of this code is pretty straightforward and works completely fine. So to actually make this work in an iOS project, we have to set up a Gradle build file. And here I have an example of what that would look like. And mostly what we have to do is tell it that we're compiling for iOS for an iPhone simulator or a regular iPhone, and that would allow the project to create a library that will work on iOS. And then we want to have some sort of folder structure that looks similar to the points that I have down here, which is to kind of have our Kotlin code in our iOS project. And then the more important part is having a builds folder. And I'll get to that in a second, because what we do every time we run our Xcode project, we want it to actually call this build script. And what the build script's going to do is call the Gradle build file, and that will generate a new library. And then we'll have that new library that gets created get copied into where it's linked in our Xcode project. This caused a lot of problems before if you tried to link the one that gets recreated each time, because it would just disappear and it would be pointing to the old one that got removed. So you have to kind of set this up in a weird way, but in the end it works. You end up getting this neat library up here that's import native libs, and that allows you to call all of the code that was in that framework that we wrote in Kotlin. Here is just a view controller. We're using BrickKit on the iOS side that we have, but this is just setting up some labels and giving them half the height or half the width, and that was how you had labels on both sides in that earlier project that I showed. So what are the advantages to using Kotlin Native from doing this investigation? Well, the first thing is we're able to share UI code or share non-UI code across Android and iOS, which is super helpful because you can kind of get a bunch of people to work on similar projects. Like here at Wayfair, we're doing the similar a similar app on both Android and iOS. So a lot of those teams are working on very similar projects at the same time. And it'd be great if you could speed up that kind of work by getting all of the Kotlin code to be shared amongst those teams. And especially because we feel like Swift isn't so far away from Kotlin code. You might have seen in like this slide, it's not really hard to read Swift code once you understand Kotlin code. And same vice versa. So hopefully being able to share those across platforms is a major benefit. One of the things that you might notice is when you're doing a project like that, when you click run, the only time that you'll recompile the Kotlin library is if anything in that library changed. So a big part of doing this project is that you could break up your app into all of its subcomponents or modularize it, and that way only if a team ends up changing something in their specific area will that be put into the whole compiling process. So hopefully that will help speed up compile times, and your actual Swift code gets reduced down to just some view controllers and routers. So there's not a lot going on to compile Swift, which we know on the iOS side takes a decent amount of time right now. So that hopefully could be a benefit in the future. And then being able to share things like test the non-UI code for both platforms. You only have to write tests once, and if either side breaks it, then you have more developers to kind of investigate that code and fix bugs. And then finally, JetBrains keeps adding more functionality, as we saw with the collections interop in the newest version, 0.6. So there are disadvantages. Obviously, I've gone through a couple of these. It actually was pretty tricky to set up. I have knowledge of Android and iOS coming into this, so it was a lot of difficulty with talking with JetBrains folks to actually get this whole thing set up properly and get something running. But once you get past that, there are obviously a ton of benefits, and hopefully in the future, things like making network requests and parsing JSON data will come easier as more people write out frameworks that can make that a lot less code heavy. Another thing is that Android Studio right now doesn't have the native lib plugin, which is basically code completion. All of that doesn't really work with the platform libraries that we have. You have to do that in C-line right now. So instead of juggling between just 2 IDEs, you usually have like 3. So that was a little bit chaotic, and half the time I just would write something and see if it worked in C-Line and then just paste it into Android Studio because I didn't want to deal with that. And then we also have using platform-specific libraries was not straightforward. Obviously, there was some issues with using it the exact way you would use it in Swift. So that was something that you have to know going forward. And then finally, this thing that I didn't get to in the actual project of creating that app, but was investigating earlier when I was just getting code running, is there's some weird conversions that happen from Kotlin to Swift. And I saw this around closures, where if you actually write something that takes in a Kotlin closure in Kotlin code, then how do you call that in iOS? And here what I had to do to get the compiler on the iOS side not to complain was actually type alias unit, which is Kotlin's version of void on the Swift side, and pass that in as what we get back from that completion handler. And this works. When you print unit, it gives you that string back. So you would be able to cast unit at that point to string, knowing that's what's actually coming back. But this was the only way that our Xcode compiler wasn't complaining about what we were expecting to get back. So there are still some things that I think can be improved in the future, and hopefully as more tooling comes through from JetBrains, we'll be able to see more and better uses for this. But I'm definitely excited to see this happen, and I think both teams could benefit from it a lot, and it would probably bring teams at all companies a lot closer together in discussing how they would go about designing things, and really everyone would own the code base as like one team instead of just two. So yeah, and that's my talk. Any questions?
You alluded to more tooling from JetBrains.
Yep.
And that I find very intriguing, since not only do they do languages, but they also, I guess, do some IDEs. And I would guess that they very much want to reduce a lot of the dissonance between IntelliJ, Android Studio, and Xcode. Are you aware of anything along that line?
Yeah, so I actually went to Kotlin Conf last year, and at one of the talks, one of the JetBrains folks kind of alluded to the fact that, yes, this doesn't make a lot of sense to do multi-platform projects in all of these different IDEs, or even just in C-Line, because the support isn't really there yet. He hinted at that they're working on it, and that might be a hint of something coming in the future, maybe an IDE that kind of takes care of all of these different multi-platform projects and can do it more eloquently. But as of right now, it's just speculation. We'll have to wait and see what they actually come out with. Yeah. Question?
Is there any debug tooling available on either side of the mobile?
So, yeah, I believe that when you actually run this on Xcode's side of things, if you hit like breakpoints and stuff, you can actually read that as well as you could when you were writing Swift. I'm not positive. I forget if I actually used the LLDB, which is like our, once you're in a breakpoint, like printing out different things. But it looked better than what I was expecting, which was I could kind of figure out, oh, something is going wrong here. Like maybe this is not working because of this, or.
You set breakpoints inside the Kotlin code.
I believe that's possible, but I'm not positive. Yeah, I'd have to look that up if anyone else knows. Yeah.
There's a debug flag that you can access them, or I don't actually know what it does.
Yeah, I never got to that in my investigation, but yeah, it potentially. Yeah, because, well, the main thing is the library itself, when it gets compiled, you have the headers there at least, so that's how it's knowing to use that. So I would assume anything that you could really do with you know, a Swift framework, you potentially could do with this Kotlin framework, even if at this moment you can't do it. Yeah. Question?
Outside some of the disadvantages and some of the tooling issues, how do you feel about taking what you did and turning it into a production level thing? Do you think that that's possible if the near future, or is it going to take a couple more cycles of them improving their tools and everything else before you're confident in that?
Yeah, I think I personally would say if you had like a very large app and you thought like, could we do this right now? The answer is probably not. I think if enough people are excited about this, though, there's a lot of opportunity for just regular developers to kind of help out with making those platform libraries a little bit better, or like making ways so that we can utilize that whole Kotlin Native better than it is right now. I think hopefully in the future JetBrains realizes this is something that could be super useful and will continue to refine it. I think we'd have to get to a point, though, where either we do have some sort of all-encompassing IDE that can kind of set up these projects automatically, because there's just a lot of code there that, or a lot of ramp-up time to getting it all set up that I think could get automated eventually, especially with just like create new project and checking off settings and stuff. Like that's possible in the future. I think it's just probably on their roadmap. They're still trying to get the whole conversion as best as possible before moving on to refining it. But hopefully in the future, yeah, as of right now, it's kind of just fun to investigate and see what the possibilities are. There was more I definitely want to do with this. I didn't even get into like using that Kotlin Native now on the Android side, but obviously we know that's possible. And then I wanted to see kind of what our compile times are and performance, how that's affected by this as well. Question?
I maybe don't answer this because you said you were more focused on 0.5 and 0.6, but have you looked at any of the multi-platform stuff and how that can help with this too?
Yeah, it was kind of difficult to like gauge what to look at. The resources online right now aren't very straightforward, especially because older versions of writing Kotlin Native have like nothing to do with how you would do it now. And I think that's actually something that I want hopefully JetBrains to get better at doing, is kind of coming up with more documentation that points out ways of doing things like this a lot easier, because half of the stuff I ran into here was only figured out after someone from JetBrains answered a GitHub issue about how you would go about doing something. So yeah, I think there's a lot of information out there, and it's hard to pick out what is useful for specifically what you're trying to do versus what's useful for like all multi-platform projects. I know that they're working on building all of that out too. But yeah, just trying to focus and get as much information about using it for Android and iOS was kind of the goal for this project. Cool. One more question? Yep.
Looking at the iOS community, like as an Android developer, I know how Kotlin's doing in the Android world. I know, sort of how the community views it as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
On the iOS side, at a language level, do you think that overall iOS developers, when they hear about something like Kotlin, are not particularly interested because it's a lot like Swift and they already know Swift, or very interested because it is similar? And then when it comes to the cross-platform and being able to share the code base, is that something that is an idea that like iOS communities are actually actively talking about, or is that a really fringe idea at the moment?
So I'd say, at least in my personal experience, I've had mixed reviews of the whole situation. Some people come into it and go like, no, I don't want to become an Android developer, or like, you're stealing away our like jobs of like being an iOS dev because Kotlin's so similar. But then you also get people where like I came back and presented to the iOS team about interesting stuff in Kotlin and the differences between Swift, and people came out of that like, oh my God, I wish we had coroutines and stuff like that because that's awesome. So I think it all depends how you're kind of proposing it to people. I think everyone's kind of on board with the whole idea of when they learn more, and I think this goes for the Java side too, once you understand what it is and like how it's beneficial, you kind of pick up like, oh, okay, this is a good language. Like, I'm not as afraid to jump on it and want to learn more about it. From a Swift standpoint, like I was saying, it is so similar that hopefully that helps break the divide of it being like an Android-specific language versus iOS. While like Java you have a lot more to kind of jump up in like language to get to that Kotlin level. While like anyone here that has done iOS will look at like optionals and stuff that's happening in Kotlin and say like, oh, okay, I feel comfortable writing this. And that's personally how I felt when I started, because I started with Java and Android as an Android developer and switched to Swift, and I'd written Swift for a while, and I was, kind of didn't feel like going back to Java because I had all these cool tools. So when Kotlin came out, it was like, this is great. I can finally feel like I'm writing similar way, like I'm thinking a similar way in both languages to write that code. And I think that could be the biggest benefit of Kotlin in the whole community, is just getting people to be thinking about how to write that code similar on both sides of the spectrum there. But yeah. All right. One more question?
Do you think using the Viper architecture works cross-platform better than something like MVVM?
So yeah, that was another thing. I wanted to investigate what other architectures would work. I think the reason Viper showed some benefits is that there's a lot of boilerplate code to Viper, and if you only have to write that boilerplate once, then hopefully that saves you a lot more time versus like something where maybe you're just creating a couple classes. But yeah, I think it's still possible to use other frameworks for this as well. I think anywhere where you're able to separate out business logic is really going to benefit from being able to write something once versus writing it on both sides. All right, thank you.